night that killed over 300 and left more than 1,000 sailors and civilians injured. Tonight, Russ Coughlin takes us back to 1944 and the explosion at Port Chicago.
You know, for months here at Channel 7, we're putting together a lot of research on a particular big rattle and bang that happened here back in 1944. And I wanted to do a little story today and tell you something about it. Some of the pictures will be very reminiscent of this, which tells it far better than I could. This newsreel clip from Paramount Pictures, 1944.
The explosion of 2 munition ships in San Francisco Bay shocks the world. An explosion recalling this harbor blast in Bombay, India, 3 months ago. The new American disaster happened near Port Chicago, a town of 1,500 population, 30 miles north of San Francisco. The earth-shaking explosion happened at night, killing 321 persons. These films, passed by Navy censorship, tell an appalling story of the wreckage of the Port Chicago Naval magazine. Damage to Navy property alone is estimated at over $6 million. The 2 ships, the Quinault Victory and the E.A. Bryan, were torn apart by the blast. Amazingly enough, bombs still rest in an ammunition train near the dock. Huge pieces of jagged metal were blown for miles. In the town of Port Chicago, not one building left undamaged. Clocks were stopped at explosion time, about 10:20 p.m. Strangely, only 2 persons were injured when this theater's wall was blown in. Desolation everywhere. A few hours before, the air was full of flying glass. Every window in town was broken. The big job of reconstruction begins. A Navy court of inquiry takes steps to discover the cause of the strange and terrifying explosion, which injured at least 1,000, some of them Navy men asleep in their barracks. The mystery will probably never be solved, for only small pieces of the ships remain.
We'll be telling you the whole story, and it's a really interesting, intriguing story about that big bang in June here on Channel 7. Let us know. We'll tell you the whole story.
Okay, Russ, that is the news at 5. Thanks for joining us. Don't go away.
Pete Wilson is here now with a look at what's coming up in the next hour.
Well, next on Channel 7 News at 6, it was not your imagination running away with you. Yes, it did indeed snow today. We'll have the latest for you. Plus, we'll switch live to the Southland where the great gobs of oily goo continue to wash ashore. And will the 90...
That place is going to blow up someday. The way those guys are handling that ammunition.
More than once, the thought struck me they're going to blow this joint up some night.
Some of these days we're going to blow this place to kingdom come.
Imagine an explosion so powerful that a ship this size is literally vaporized. A blast so great that the ship docked next to it, a vessel also this large, is lifted completely out of the water, turned around, torn in 2, and the stern thrown almost 2 football fields away. A detonation with such force that a huge diesel locomotive, 16 of these boxcars, and a 1,200-foot pier are sucked up into a boiling pillar of flame that towers 2 miles up into the sky. Imagine, if you will, an explosion that tears an enormous hole in the bottom of the bay and sends a 30-foot wall of water smashing toward the opposite shore. Now, that explosion did happen here, right here at a place along the Contra Costa shoreline. It's just 13 miles upriver from Carquinez Strait, right up where the Sacramento pours into the bay. It was here, at the edge of Sissoon Bay, that the Navy had a munitions loading dock and a town called Port Chicago. On that terrible July night in 1944, 320 men were killed instantly. Most simply vanished in a tower of flame. It was the worst home front disaster of World War II. The cause remains a mystery to this day. Well, what really did happen at Port Chicago? I'm Russ Coughlin. I'm inviting you to join Channel 7 on a quest for the answers to a tragic yet an intriguing 45-year-old puzzle. Questions were raised about sabotage. Some mentioned a midget submarine in the bay, and others talked of a catastrophic accident, perhaps involving an unstable secret weapon. Or was it simply carelessness on a horribly monumental scale? Now, at least one man claims it was a nuclear explosion, possibly the first atomic test, and he claims to have the evidence. Tonight, we'll examine the facts. We'll talk to the witnesses and investigate the theories. And we'll meet the man who was the nearest to that explosion and survived. An eyewitness whose story has never been told before.
But somewhere down the line where that ammunition was loaded, somebody set a trap.
And we will relive the incredible drama of that night with those who were there. The men and women who can never forget that time when the dark night sky burned red over our San Francisco Bay. This is where it happened. And only those rotting stubs of blasted pilings marked the place where two ships, a string of freight cars, a locomotive, and 320 men were blown into a pillar of flame. And just last summer, a simple memorial was dedicated to the men whose lives ended in a perplexing disaster here on July 17th of 1944. Before speculating on why they died, here are the facts of the world in which they lived. That summer of 1944, Americans were in the midst of the greatest military struggle in history. And after a year of bitter fighting mile by mile up the Italian peninsula, victorious GIs rolled through the streets of Rome in June. But another 11 months of battle lay ahead on that Italian soil. June 6th, D-Day, Operation Overlord. 175,000 men, 5,000 ships, 4,000 landing craft, 11,000 planes. The first step on the long, bloody march to Berlin. By July, the invasion had begun to bog down in France, and the death toll was mounting. In the Pacific, GIs and Leathernecks were fighting a tough, vicious jungle war on islands with exotic names: Bougainville, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Guadalcanal, and Iwitak. And in June, Saipan. For the guys overseas, the final victory seemed to be down a very long and very deadly tunnel. Here on the home front, the entire San Francisco Bay region was a giant war machine. This was the greatest West Coast port of embarkation and a major supply base for the Pacific War. At the north end of San Francisco Bay, much of the ammunition destined for the Pacific battlefields was being handled. At Mare Island, that's just across the water from Vallejo and next to the big Navy Yard, was a naval ammunition depot, crammed with torpedoes, depth charges, bombs, and shells. And across the hill, the historical Benicia Arsenal had been charged with new life since Pearl Harbor. Now its workshops bustled with 4,500 civilian employees and 1,000 troops. The Army's ordnance headquarters for the Pacific Campaign, it supplied everything from machine gun bullets to 500-pound bombs. And across the Sacramento River and Suisun Bay, and just upstream, stood the new Naval Ammunition Magazine at Port Chicago. 7,000 acres of railroad yards and piers, warehouses and bunkers loaded with rockets, bombs, and shells, high explosives of every sort. Day and night, more were brought in from all over the country by 2 transcontinental rail lines. And on the Port Chicago waterfront, munition ships were being loaded 2 at a time, 24 hours a day. Just over a mile from the pier, Port Chicago was a little town that had given its name to the munitions base. It had survived one way or another through the years, depending on a grain warehouse, a smelter, a lumber mill, or a shipyard. But one after another, those businesses failed or left. And in 1931, civic boosters figured a new name might attract new industry. Thinking big, if not very originally, they decided Chicago would be a good name. The United States Post Office disagreed, and so the Chamber of Commerce compromised on Port Chicago. But no industrialists showed up. That was just about the last excitement here until 1942, and then the Navy arrived with warehouses and workshops and wharves and high explosives. By the summer of '44, there were almost 2,000 sailors and civilians at what had become the principal Pacific Coast loading and storage point for ammunition. In 1944, the Navy, like all the armed forces, was still racially segregated. At Port Chicago, all the sailors who did the back-breaking and dangerous work of loading explosives were black. All of the commissioned officers were white. And so were all of the Marines who guarded the base and patrolled the strongly fenced perimeter with guard dogs. It was not a happy base.
It was racism on the base. 95% of the sailors there were black. And they had white sailors there, but they was carpenters, electricians, you know. They didn't have many blacks. Most of the blacks were stevedores and leaders of the different divisions.
In fact, we had white carpenters mates in our divisions that was assigned under me, but they didn't live in the same barracks. They lived in another barracks. And all the officers were white, there's no doubt about it.
They joined the United States Navy to fight. They wanted to fight, that's what they wanted. They did not want to load ammunition, they wanted to fight.
What's more, none of the sailors had been given any training in handling high explosives.
Wasn't anybody around to train us because we were the first one here. So we was just handling it the best way we could. We had some officers who claimed they were cargo experts, but I doubt that very seriously too.
And a lot of people came in here like myself, have never seen a ship before. But still, that when they started the operation, I was driving a winch. I'd never been on a ship before. I didn't know what a winch was.
They learned by doing the job. And it would seem that the Navy brass of those days didn't think much of that job, nor of the men that they assigned to do it. Now here's an official Navy memo from 1944 that outlines those requirements. Their willingness to obey instructions, it says, is more important than even normal average intelligence and skill. And it specifies, special instructional courses on munitions handling not considered feasible because they would confuse simple minds. The Longshoremen's Union disagreed. When the ILWU was unable to get its own men on the job, the union offered to at least provide some training for the Navy recruits. That offer was ignored.
We did offer to the Navy our services. We had extremely trained people. Men were trained in the handling of ammunition, and we felt that putting green men in that was a very dangerous situation. The Navy felt that the military could handle it, but we knew darn well that anything else probably, but not ammunition. Ammunition was really something that was like a tinderbox, and it could blow up and really hurt kill a lot of people.
The Coast Guard also warned that loading practices at Port Chicago were highly dangerous. In fact, the captain of the port finally withdrew the Coast Guard detail because conditions were so bad that he was unwilling to be held responsible. Meanwhile, a speed up in loading ammunition was ordered. Now, each loading gang was put in competition with every other gang, and officers were laying bets on which shift could load the most explosives. In a very real sense, in mid-July of 1944, Port Chicago was sitting on a powder keg that was about to blow sky high. It is the evening of July 17th, 1944. The Liberty ship E.A. Bryan is docked at Port Chicago, California. She's riding low and creaking and already loaded with over 4,000 tons of ammunition and bombs. She's taking on more by the hour. Now, for 4 days, the sailors at Port Chicago have been sweating in the docks and inner holds, storing lethal cargo 24 hours a day. The E.A. Bryan is only 5 months old, just back from her maiden voyage to the Pacific. During the loading, there's been some trouble with the winches. The bearing had gone on one, but it's been replaced, and the brakes really weren't functioning too well on another. It isn't clear whether that's been fixed or not, but the loading still continues at top speed. Another ship, the Quinault Victory, has been docked on the other side of the pier at 6 that evening. It's a brand new Victory ship just out of the yards in Portland, Oregon. She's scheduled to take on a full cargo of ammunition, but right now she's being rigged for loading, which is scheduled to start at midnight. And here's the way it works. Back in the railroad yards, boxcars loaded with explosives are held in 40 barricaded revetments. They're railroad sidings with mounds of earth piled on each side to guard against a chain explosion. Now, when loading gets underway, the freight cars are shuttled to the piers. Then they're unpacked by hand. Bombs and other explosives are rolled down an incline or taken off with a lift truck. Now, small shells and boxes of ammo are passed along manually or moved by hand trucks. In nets or slings or on pallets, they're hoisted by the ship's cranes over the side and into the hold, where they're stowed layer by layer until the ship is filled. In releasing these films to us, the Navy requested that we make clear that these loading techniques are no longer used. But in 1944, at Port Chicago, this was standard procedure. Like most Liberty ships, the Bryan has 5 holds, each as deep as a 4-story building. By 10 p.m., hold number 5 is filled with 20 and 40 millimeter shells, and more 40s are being loaded. In number 4 hold, 20s and 40s plus 14-inch naval shells and fragmentation cluster bombs. Hold 3, 1,000-pound aerial bombs, and on top, 5,000-pound bombs. Number 2 is filled with 3-inch shells and anti-submarine depth bombs. In the number 1 hold, 5-inch projectiles, and now incendiary bombs, hot cargo. The fuses are installed and everyone knows they are dangerous. On the pier, 16 boxcars loaded with fuses, detonators, smokeless powder, and more. A train with 470 tons of explosives in all. At 10:15, when he leaves the pier, the assistant loading officer notices that the men are having some kind of difficulty getting the bombs out of the boxcars because they're wedged in too tight. He is the last to leave. 3 minutes later, at 43 seconds after 10:18 p.m., all the rest, 320 men, will die. According to Navy records, more than 10 million pounds of explosives went off. Within 1,000 yards, total destruction, instant death. All fatalities were within that perimeter. 5,000 feet away, severe damage, many casualties. At 8,000 feet, considerable damage to most buildings and personal property. Most of the 390 injured were within this range, but the damage extended much further, up to 40 miles away. In midstream, on Roe Island, there's a lighthouse, and the explosion blew out the windows of the lighthouse keeper's residence. And the tidal wave swept all the way across the island, tossing his boat 40 feet up on the beach. A Coast Guard patrol boat was plowing upstream and was about 500 yards off the pier. The blast smashed the wheelhouse and threw the pilot to the deck, and then a 30-foot wall of water swept over the boat, all but swamping it. Now, a tanker that was owned by Union Oil, the MS Redline, was moving downstream when it was about 3/4 of a mile offshore. Red-hot steel showered its decks and blasted through its bulkheads, leaving the ship a drifting hulk. Overhead, an Army C-47 cargo plane was on its way from Oakland to Sacramento, cruising at 9,000 feet. The co-pilot reported a geyser of flame with pieces of metal as big as a house, glowing red and orange and rocketing high above the plane. And not all of those details were reported in that year of wartime censorship. And the first reports were inaccurate, showing higher casualties than were actually confirmed in the final count. And yet, in print and with pictures and on film, the media of 1944 did document the horrible devastation on that Port Chicago night.
The explosion of 2 munition ships in San Francisco Bay shocks the world. Damage to Navy property alone is estimated at over $6 million. The 2 ships, the Quinault Victory and the E.A. Bryan, were torn apart by the blast. Amazingly enough, bombs still rest in an ammunition train near the dock. Huge pieces of jagged metal were blown for miles. In the town of Port Chicago, not one building left undamaged. Clocks were stopped at explosion time, about 10:20 p.m. Strangely, only 2 persons were injured when this theater's wall was blown in. Desolation everywhere. A few hours before, the air was full of flying glass. Every window in town was broken. The big job of reconstruction begins. A Navy court of inquiry takes steps to discover the cause of the strange and terrifying explosion which injured at least 1,000, some of them Navy men asleep in their barracks. The mystery will probably never be solved, for only small pieces of the ships remain.
What the newspaper accounts and the newsreel description could not evoke was the terror of that night, the way it was etched into the memories of those who lived it. People like Frank Harris, a Navy employee waiting to go aboard the ill-fated Bryan.
I wasn't far from where I'm at right now. Maybe just a few feet back towards the water from where I am right now.
Frank worked in the carpentry shop that stood here then.
A big blast of flame, and then an air wave, like a wind blowing. And then the explosions, 2 of them. Concussion was terrible. I felt like I was bleeding from my eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and everything. And then I saw all that stuff up in the sky, and it just came down pitter-patter all over the place. And I thought, well, something's going to go through me. I won't get out of this without getting punctured. And I was feeling around in the dark to see if I could feel any blood, and I couldn't feel any. I wasn't bleeding, but everything was wiped out. In places, the wreckage, slivers and things were piled up 6 or 7 feet deep.
Facing the ships, all of a sudden, hell broke loose.
Frank Lozano, a machinist on the base, was driving a pickup from the electrical shop toward the pier. His buddy Preston Robbins was welding in the machine shop, a big shed with railroad tracks running through it.
I was blowing across 3 tracks. I don't remember how I got there. I guess I was blowing across, you know.
The first thing came to my mind that says, I think I'm a goner. I was just waiting to say goodbye.
Everything was rocking and stuff was falling through the ceiling, and I could hear stuff going through the walls, you know.
Just high as I could see. The most beautiful lights you ever seen, every light in the rainbow.
We were lucky.
Yeah, very, very.
And I wouldn't go through it again for $1 million.
Just before the explosion, I was in my quarters. I was petty officer at the time, and my barracks was located about 50 feet over there.
We were standing possibly right on the site in the barracks where I was at that night. And I was due to go aboard the ships.
Well, I was out just between the 2 barracks at the time, taking the hat off the clothesline. And I just got the hat off when the first explosion went off.
Claude Duke Ellington, DeWitt Jameson, Morris Sublé, all Navy petty officers then, all men who had loaded ammunition.
There were 2 explosions. Most people don't realize there were 2. Now, the first one was pretty minor, and it made the lights act like they had a short in them. And by the time I walked from my bunk, which was about 8 or 10 feet, to the door to check the lights, the explosion happened, and I got knocked back on the floor in between 2 lockers.
I thought really we were being attacked. And the second explosion knocked me from my bunk on the floor. And there where I stayed and I hollered out and told the rest of my men to hit the deck. Then the whole building just seemed to have caved in.
The second one went off and I went down. And when I went down, I realized that it was a ship blowing out because I was outside. I could see the red flame and everything. So my question was, how the hell I get off of here?
everything was going up. I could see smoke, some shells going off.
It looked like a big rolling ball of fire.
The building was, well, just blown to death.
And the men were running all over, falling all over in the glass from the explosion.
And the barracks that I was in, you couldn't tell it was a building really the next morning.
The man closest to the cataclysm. His story next.
First thing went off was a car. I've come to the conclusion that there was a bomb planted in them cars where when you break them seals and open them doors, you set that bomb off.
Aaron D. Buck Jones, probably the closest surviving witness to the tragedy at Port Chicago.
I was definitely the closest survivor to them boats because the joiner's shop was just off of the dock.
The joinery, also called the carpentry shop. He was at the end of the building nearest the ships, and he had waved to the engineer bringing in the loaded munitions train.
The engineer come in with his 18 carloads of ammunition. I waved him. I'm probably the last man that ever spoke to that man.
Jones was a civilian employee, a rigger, and while the rest of his crew took a smoke break, he stayed in the shop.
But when the first car went off, I can remember when I was this high off the floor, and it was shaking me just like a jackhammer would shake you. And I looked down at this stack of glass, and it exploded, literally exploded. My hat, there's glass went up through my hat this way. And there's another boom, 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 just like that. And I knew that was them cars that were going off. Then the boat went off. When the boat went off, well, that was all. I didn't know no more until I came to out there buried, standing on my head and fighting the water and mud out of my face. It turned to blood, and I could feel it sticky, so I said, this is blood. I better get out of here. So I went to kicking this timbers this way and that way and made me a hole in the top of this debris I was in and made a hole and got out of there. And I walked, 50 yards, I guess. And I fell across a piling that was blowed out there.
A young black man found Buck Jones and got him to a hospital. Jones never learned the man's name, but he credits him with saving his life. His wounds were severe.
This doctor looked at me and he says, I remember this very well. He says, well, this is the worst beat up man that I ever saw. And if he lives, it'll fool me. Well, I thought to myself, I said, well, I'm gonna fool you.
We found the official Navy listing on Jones under severely injured, at least partial disability expected. When he got out of the hospital, Buck Jones went back to work, perhaps too soon. After a couple of weeks on the job, his wounds were getting increasingly painful.
And while I'm waiting, there in the dispensary, sitting there on the bench waiting, there was 3 doctors standing out here in the hall. And one of them referred to me like this. He said, he's one of these guys that's looking for pension, looking for get a soft touch. Made me mad. I got up and I cussed him out and hobbled out. And that's the last I ever had any contact with the base.
As far as the Navy is concerned, that's when Jones disappeared. He says he simply walked out in disgust without even collecting his final pay. And he never filed a claim for his injuries.
I was real patriotic. So I thought, well, the government had lost enough there without me asking for any more. I got out with my life, and lucky for that, and I never did ask him for nothing.
And that's why the Navy Board of Inquiry never heard the closest survivor's firm belief that this was a case of sabotage, that one of the freight cars was booby-trapped.
I think that somebody set a trap in them cars down the line that didn't want that ammunition to go overseas.
Those who remember the night that white-hot metal rained from the sky say it's incredible that the death count wasn't in the thousands. The great blast wave of the Port Chicago explosion rocked communities for miles. It was registered on seismographs from Pasadena to Eureka and Mount Shasta, even in Boulder City, Nevada, 425 miles away. In the town of Port Chicago, just a mile from the blast, many citizens reported a close brush with death. It's remarkable that none were killed as smoking metallic chunks plummeted out of the dark, slicing through roofs and walls. The streets were riddled with shards of flying glass. Live 3-inch and 5-inch shells peppered the town, yet miraculously none exploded. Still, 109 people were injured here. 90% of the homes and all of the businesses were damaged, many a total loss. Jake Perez and Lou Rangel were teenagers then, part of a large extended family that was living across the railroad tracks from the base. Jake's dad forbid them to use the family pickup truck, but as soon as he fell asleep, the boys and the rest of the kids, 13 in all, piled in and took off with Jake at the wheel and Lou beside him. They were at the town's main intersection.
It was a small blast followed by a tremendous explosion after that.
Lit the whole sky. I mean, lit everything. So we started looking up, and the kid says, look, like 4th of July.
It had to be 1,000, 2,000 feet in the air, just like boom.
All of a sudden, the concussion hit us, and we were just, I mean, it hit us so hard.
It picked up the truck. I don't know how high it picked it up, but it picked it up and it came down again, and it jarred the hell out of it.
We start hearing pieces of metal hitting all around us, like little ringing sounds all around us.
It was raining pieces of metal. It was terrible.
This airplane was going over, and you can hear somebody yelled out, "The Japanese are bombing us," and boy, that pushed the panic button. So we jumped in the pickup, and we took everybody down to this bridge, put all the kids underneath it, and I stood with them. This stuff, I mean, we were sitting in a keg of dynamite all the time and not even realizing it.
That keg of dynamite extended well beyond Port Chicago to communities all around Suisun Bay. In the Mountain View section of Martinez, Frank Atelli was a 10-year-old who was sitting up in bed, gazing out his window.
And I was leaning on one hand like this, you know, look at the stars. And all of a sudden I saw this gigantic propane welder's torch turned upside down because it made like a peak, but it was all white and sparkly on the side. I heard something spinning, and what it did, it knocked out the screen, the little wooden half screens they used to have in the old days, and it was spinning on the bedpost.
In Concord, Dorothy McWilliams was driving with her children when she saw a great flash and fiery burst all over the sky.
And I said to the children in the back seat, cover yourselves, cover yourselves. I said, there's going to be a big boom. And it picked the car up, rocked me back and forth, threw me against the windshield. I went back again. And I felt like someone had taken a 2x4 and hit me over the back of the head.
On the waterfront at Benicia, the ferry boat had just pulled in. A 17-year-old deckhand, Harold Baker, had just come on deck from the aft cabin.
I seen this large gigantic flash. It was of a red and orange-yellow texture to it, and all of a sudden there was nothing. I mean, empty as black. Well, moments later, this terrific rip boom blew the windows out in our boat down on the lower deck. So all night long until 6 o'clock in the morning, we ran hell-bell just back and forth, you know, carrying the burnt and the wounded.
In Pittsburgh, teenager Elvira Severin and her 2 sisters were coming out of a movie when they saw a rainbow of colors in the sky.
And I said, that's too high to be fireworks, and then bam, the explosion hit, and it hit so hard, it knocked us down. And we got scared and looked for the first shelter because we thought we were being bombed by the Japanese at the time. It was that severe.
A crowded passenger train was rolling through Solano County toward Sacramento when a big flame appeared in the distance. Arthur Chomer, a soldier returning from leave, explained it away as a gas burn-off from a refinery.
And I no sooner said that than they heard like a thump, and the car shook, and then the window kind of cracked. And then a bigger flame, a bigger thump, and the windows started to shatter. We were thrown out of our seats. I mean, the second blast was so great into the aisle, and the train slowed down, and the conductor came running on the side of the train, says Port Chicago blew up.
How destructive was that blast wave? Damage claims come in from as far away as Petaluma and the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. As terrible as the devastation was, and it was awesome, some $12 million worth, there was, of course, the human toll that shook all of those who witnessed it. Some were hardly more than children at the time.
I went into the base about a week later because I got hired, two other friends of mine and myself. They gave us some white stakes that we would put wherever we would find pieces of flesh or a body or whatever. And then later on the Navy would come in. They would just gather all the pieces that were identified by this white stake, and then for quite some time we'd see flatbed trucks leaving the base with coffins in them, and this went on for quite a while.
My father forbid us to go to the beach, to the riverfront, because every day they were picking up parts of bodies, legs, arms, different things.
We found two bodies. One was an officer, and the other was an enlisted man. They both were naked because the blast had blown off their clothes. However, their belt was on, and that's one reason the Navy always made it mandatory that you stencil your name on the inside of your belt, so that if that's all there was, they had some way of finding out who you were, you know.
Of the 320 who perished in that pillar of flame, the bodies of most were not recovered. Of those that were, only 51 were sufficiently intact to be identified. The remainder are at rest in graves simply marked, unknown sailor. Was the Port Chicago disaster a nuclear explosion? That question was posed in the spring of 1982, not by one of those sensational papers you find by the supermarket checkout stand, but by a responsible scholarly journal. The author of that article, Peter Vogel, was and still is convinced that the answer is yes, and moreover, that it was no accident.
I do believe that the explosion of Port Chicago was a purposeful test of the Hiroshima weapon. There was a lot to be gained from a military point of view, from what the military needed to know about that type of detonation.
Who is Peter Vogel? Well, the producers of this program looked carefully at his qualifications as a researcher and a reporter, and over a 6-month period had extensive correspondence and conversation with him. Vogel was a journalism student and also studied physics under Edward Teller at UC Berkeley, where he graduated in 1967. He's been an investigative reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, an editor for a major electronics magazine, and for 10 years, an information specialist and liaison officer for the state of New Mexico's energy programs. Since 1982, Vogel has made his views on Port Chicago known through articles and interviews. Last October, he moved back to the Bay Area where he's writing a book based on his series. Here are excerpts from our own in-depth interview with Peter Vogel. His story, as he told it to us. It begins with a church rummage sale in 1980 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where Vogel bought a box of photographic materials, and at the bottom, he found an intriguing piece of paper.
The title that's typed on it says History of 10,000-Ton Gadget. And most of the document is mathematics, but at the left margin there is a sequence of steps that are numbered 1 through 11. and it starts with detonation and ends with the formation of the ball of fire. And I looked at that and pretty much right away knew that I had a document that related to atomic bombs. So I bought the document and paid $0.25 for it and took it home and began to study it and went through the steps and noticed that down at the bottom of the document it said that the ball of fire mushroomed out at 18,000 feet in typical Port Chicago fashion. Now, in my reading about the history of the atomic weapons program in the United States before the end of the Second World War, I had never heard of any reference to a place called Port Chicago. So at that point, I decided probably the best information I could get about what this document was to go over to Los Alamos, to the bomb laboratory over there, and start asking people, what is this thing that I found? So the first person I went to was Dr. Edward Teller. And he looked at it with quite a bit of interest, and then finally handed it back to me and said, I believe you have a classified document. Will never acknowledge having seen this document or having discussed Port Chicago with you. There were really two things that had to be established in the very beginning to determine whether or not it was even possible for a nuclear weapon to have been detonated at the time of Port Chicago. One is I had to establish whether or not enough uranium, fissionable uranium, had been produced by that time, and then whether or not the weapon had been designed by the time of Port Chicago.
Now, to follow the next part of Peter Vogel's story, a brief explanation. Two kinds of atomic bombs were designed and dropped on Japan. One nicknamed Little Boy, and the other was designated Fat Man. Now, Little Boy is comparatively simple. Basically, a chunk of uranium-235 called the bullet, and another chunk, the target rings, carefully machined to fit together. And a cordite charge fires the bullet down the unrifled naval gun barrel into the target, which causes the nuclear explosion. Now, the government claims that this device, the uranium bomb, was never tested before it was dropped on Hiroshima. Fat Man is much more complex. A ball is made up of blocks of high explosives designed in truncated pyramid shapes and perfectly fit together. Now, all must be set off at precisely the same instant to squeeze this inside sphere made of natural uranium, which in turn squeezes a ball of plutonium about the size of a human eyeball. It's compressed to half its original size, an implosion, causing a much greater nuclear reaction. This type of sophisticated device, Fat Man, the plutonium bomb, was the one tested on the New Mexico desert and then dropped on Nagasaki. It is Vogel's conviction that it was this bomb, the simpler Little Boy, also called the gun weapon because the uranium is fired down a gun barrel, that exploded at Port Chicago.
The government always said that there hadn't been enough uranium produced to allow a test of that weapon before it was used at Hiroshima. Using the offices of my position in the state of New Mexico, I was finally able, from two offices of the U.S. Department of Energy, to get the uranium production statistics for the early years, and found that, in fact, there had been a large quantity of that uranium that had been produced that had never been acknowledged. But we still didn't know whether that weapon had been specified by that time.
He says an exhaustive search of government documents provides the answer.
Every particular detail that was necessary to construct the Hiroshima weapon that was detonated in 1945 had been completed by mid-February of 1944. So, in fact, there had been enough uranium produced by that time and a weapon that had been completely designed in every particular detail and the hardware ordered by the middle of February of 1944. Then I began to look at the parameters of the explosion at Port Chicago. How big was it? It was the largest explosion that had occurred in the history of the world up to that point, man-made explosion. And it had many of the artifacts of a nuclear detonation. And it finally has become my conclusion that the explosion that occurred at Port Chicago in July of 1944 was in fact an unannounced test of the weapon that was used against Hiroshima a year later.
Even if it was possible, would the United States military do this to its own facilities, to its own personnel?
In the first place, it provided the opportunity to easily measure the destructive effects of that weapon when it was detonated at the surface in a harbor. So it was a good laboratory situation. When a weapon is available that is designed to kill and destroy, the only way it is really testable is to put it in circumstances where it's going to kill and destroy. The United States has done that without a twinge of conscience. I mean, we have detonated atmospheric tests in Nevada. Over a period of years, we irradiated the landscape, we irradiated the population, we marched troops ashore at atomic tests in the South Pacific and subjected them to gross hazards and danger. Not that I seem to be critical of our country, but I see it entirely as consistent with the way this country has, and the world in fact, has tested nuclear weapons. We blow up people.
Peter Vogel admits that all his evidence is circumstantial. How does it hold up to investigation? Our staff had made many independent inquiries during the last several months, and here are some of the results. We found neither photographic evidence, personal recollections, nor descriptions of biological symptoms to indicate a nuclear explosion. The extensive burns and radiation sickness of Hiroshima, the anemia, infection, hair loss, diarrhea, and birth anomalies. We did discover, however, that the record for cancer rates in Contra Costa County is missing for 1945 and 1946. But we did find that the rate for cancer was actually higher there in 1940, 4 years before the explosion, than it was in 1950, 6 years after the event. Now, in succeeding years, for whatever reasons, it has gone much higher. The fireball from the explosion dispersed at 12,000 feet by winds from the southwest, which would put Sacramento, Roseville, Auburn, Nevada City, and Soda Springs in any pattern of fallout. But no such anomaly is found in the records. To this day, on the Port Chicago shoreline, it's still possible to pick up metal remnants of that terrible tragedy. Is it likely that some solid evidence could be found here? 2 fragments were studied, one retrieved from the blast site with Navy permission, and the other obtained through a private source and independently authenticated as a genuine remnant of the explosion. Helgeson Scientific Services in Pleasanton, a firm with a worldwide reputation for nuclear detection and analysis, tested both pieces.
That was the rusty piece of steel.
Yeah.
And we saw no radioactivity on that one whatsoever.
The analysis was personally undertaken by the firm's founder and president, George Louis Helgeson.
The other piece now.
That particular piece we're looking at here is obviously a piece of shrapnel, and you can see where it's been indented. There is no radioactivity on that piece of steel. There's been no nuclear explosion.
With this report, we broke off further study of Vogel's claim of a nuclear test at Port Chicago. We did ask eyewitnesses and survivors for their opinion.
My first thought when it first happened, I thought, oh, submarine attack. Then I realized later that it was probably impossible.
Any one of literally thousands of mechanical things. Just so happened I picked this up that night, and it's a little shackle. Well, something like that could have broken.
I just felt that it was sabotage.
I don't think it was sabotage. Quite sure it wasn't.
Carelessness. After you work so long and among the ammunition, you become careless yourself.
Truthfully, I don't think anyone knew what caused that explosion. I don't believe they ever will.
4 days after the explosion, a Navy Court of Inquiry was convened to determine the cause. The results of that investigation next. July 21st, 1944, a Navy Court of Inquiry convened to determine the reason for the Port Chicago disaster. 125 witnesses, 39 days, and hundreds of pages of testimony later, the Navy announced that this was the most detailed and accurate data ever assembled on a large explosion. But the experts still could not, with any certainty, solve the riddle. They did, however, register their suspicion that a depth charge had been accidentally detonated, setting off World War II's biggest domestic explosion. Some footnotes to this story. What happened to the town of Port Chicago? Did it just vanish? Well, according to some contemporary Contra Costa County maps, it is listed, but in parentheses it says abandoned. You see, but that's not the whole story. Not by quite a bit. It is true that the town never fully recovered from the disaster. And yet dozens of community boosters held out for the revival of Port Chicago with the enthusiasm and tenacity of the truly committed. The fact was, the Navy wanted to buy out the town, make it part of a blast-free safety zone in case of another explosion. Now, some in town were more than willing to sell, and others were steadfast against the sellout. The community split into a bitter standoff as it fell further into melancholy and decay. Finally, in the late 1960s, worn down and worn out, more than defeated, the town that stood here surrendered to the Navy. Port Chicago was bulldozed and plowed under, and well, today the town's a pasture. A couple of signs, a memory, and a name on a map with the notation, abandoned. The Port Chicago Naval Weapons Magazine was long ago rechristened, if that's the correct term. It's now the Concord Naval Weapons Station. Military explosives are still shipped from here, and the Navy neither confirms nor denies that some of those weapons are nuclear. And it's not much of a secret that indeed they could be. As a major trans-shipping point for American arms, this has become a frequent setting for demonstrations by a variety of groups protesting United States foreign policy, military intervention, and nuclear armament. Finally this, and it's much more than just a footnote. 3 weeks after that Port Chicago disaster, a work detail of 258 sailors refused to load an ammunition ship at Mare Island. Now, some of them ultimately changed their minds and others were court-martialed. But 50 were singled out and tried for mutiny right here at Treasure Island. In that wartime year, 1944, the sentence could be death by firing squad. The trial lasted 6 weeks and included over 1,400 pages of testimony. Thurgood Marshall, then chief counsel of the NAACP, came west to aid in the defense. All 50 sailors were convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison and dishonorable discharge. But in January 1946, with the war over, 49 were released from the Terminal Island Disciplinary Barracks at San Pedro. One continued serving time because of a bad record on other charges. The sailors were dispersed in overseas assignments all around the South Pacific, and over the ensuing months, all were finally brought home and quietly discharged from the Navy under honorable conditions, though their military convictions stand to this day. If any good can be said to come out of a tragedy that killed so many and had such terrible impact on so many more, perhaps that one measure of good might be this. The explosion itself and the mutiny trial which followed it focused attention on official policies of racial discrimination against men sworn to defend their country. There was angry reaction from large segments of the American public, both black and white. The Navy bureaucracy and the federal government were forced to admit those policies must be changed. In June 1945, the Navy announced the beginning of desegregation. It would be a slow process, but it may fairly be said that it started here in the shambles and wreckage of a mysterious explosion on the shoreline of Contra Costa County. The mystery of Port Chicago. What is the solution to this tragic puzzle? Within limited resources, we looked into the theses of a nuclear explosion. We found no convincing hard evidence to support it. And we considered the possibility of sabotage. And if that were the case, it would appear likely that both evidence and motive have long since disappeared, although the Navy does not dismiss it entirely, according to the Navy's Board of Inquiry papers. Although there is no evidence to support sabotage as a probable cause, it cannot be ignored as a possibility. Well, as a matter of fact, the massive official inquiry concludes with an opinion, not a solution, but only an opinion. And perhaps it's as close as we're likely to come to solving the mystery of Port Chicago. The Chief of Naval Operations concurs that the explosion probably resulted from the careless act of some individual who perished in the accident. Now, 46 years after the most disastrous home front tragedy of World War II, it would seem that the key to the mystery is sealed forever with the fate of 320 men who perished here at Port Chicago on a night in July of 1944. I'm Russ Conklin.
Mm-hmm.